Hey everyone. Ready to dive into a bit of a friendly rivalry today? We've got some really interesting sources about why New Zealand often seems to get overshadowed by Australia on the world stage.
It's a question a lot of people have.
Yeah. We've all heard about shrimp on the Barbie, but how many people know about New Zealand's fish and chips?
Right.
But I have a feeling there's a lot more to this than just funny accents and sayings, don't you think?
Definitely. What's fascinating to me is that this goes way beyond just national pride. It really gets into geography and economics and even how cultures see themselves and project themselves globally.
I like that. It's like a study in perception almost. Okay, so let's break this down. One article you sent over straight up points out the elephant in the room. Australia is huge, like 29 times bigger than New Zealand.
Yeah, that size difference is massive.
So that's going to have some pretty big implications, right?
For sure. You think about it, Australia's got a population of 26 million people. Compare that to New Zealand's 5 million. It's no wonder that Australia has a much bigger presence globally,
Yeah.
more resources, a more diverse economy, and they have a lot more influence in world affairs.
It's kind of like the article made this analogy I thought was pretty funny. It's like Australia is the older sibling with a much bigger allowance. They're out there spending their money, making a lot of noise, grabbing everyone's attention.
Uh,
And New Zealand's like the younger sibling, quietly working on their own thing in the corner.
yeah, I like that. It really shows how much size can actually influence a country's presence on the world stage.
Yeah.
But it's not just about size. We were talking about the media stuff you sent over. That was really
Sure,
interesting.
yeah. Australia is like a media powerhouse. They're out there shaping how the world sees them. You've got Chris Hemsworth, Margot Robbie, even Vegemite. Whether you love it or hate it, everyone knows about it.
Right. And they're constantly putting out these cultural touchstones that grab international attention.
I mean, I've been to New Zealand. It is absolutely stunning. Those Lord of the Rings landscapes are incredible. But it often feels like New Zealand is more of a beautiful backdrop than the main attraction.
I see what you mean. It's almost like a fundamental difference in how these two countries present themselves.
Hmm.
You know, Australia's bold, it's brash, they're always trying to be in the spotlight. New Zealand's much more understated, even humble in a way.
It's like one's shouting from the rooftops and the
Yeah.
other is quietly getting things done. Do you ever wonder if, like, as a global audience, we're missing out on something by always listening to the loudest voice? Maybe those quieter achievers like New Zealand have a different kind of wisdom to offer.
Hmm, that's interesting. It's almost like they're playing a different game,
Yeah.
not really seeking the same kind of recognition or validation, which maybe is a strength in itself.
Okay, so we've got size, we've got media. What about the research you sent about cultural differences? This is the classic loud and proud Aussies versus the humble and understated Kiwis, right?
Yeah. But this research goes way deeper than just stereotypes. It really digs into the historical roots of those differences. Like, think about Australia's convict history, that rugged frontier spirit. It's a culture that values resilience and independence. There's this mateship that's very outwardly expressed.
That makes sense. What about New Zealand?
Well, New Zealand has a strong Maori influence. They have a much closer connection to their indigenous roots. So that's fostered a culture that's all about community and humility and respect for the land. It's a very different kind of strength, more inward and understated.
It's fascinating how those historical differences can actually shape a national identity, isn't it? How does this all play out globally, though? Do you think these differences in culture affect how they're perceived on the world stage?
Oh, absolutely. It really comes down to how those cultures project themselves. Think about it. Australians with all that boisterous energy and that adventurous spirit, they're often seen as really confident, outgoing, maybe even a bit brash. Then you've got New Zealanders, quiet, determined, humble. People might see them as more reserved, maybe even shy. But it really challenges us to think about how we perceive people who are louder versus people who are quieter, right? Who are we naturally drawn to?
It makes you think, do we gravitate more towards the familiar, the things we recognize easily, even if it means maybe overlooking people with a quieter strength? It's like a reminder that the most valuable contributions can sometimes come from those who aren't constantly seeking the spotlight.
Absolutely. And it begs the question, are we as a global community missing out on the potential of people who are excelling in different ways, on different wavelengths? Maybe there's all this untapped innovation and wisdom out there just waiting to be discovered if we just shifted our focus a bit.
I'm glad you brought that up because it makes me think about the economics of it all. Australia's got this booming economy. They have a lot of power on the world stage. They can really invest in things like cultural diplomacy and international relations. It just amplifies their voice even more.
Exactly. Economic strength, equals political influence, the power to shape global discussions.
Mhm.
They could even project their culture more effectively that way. It's a huge advantage.
So where does that leave New Zealand? You mentioned before that they have a good economy, but they're on a different scale, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're doing well, but they just don't have that same financial power. It does limit how much they can compete on a global scale,
Hmm.
especially when you think about things like international aid and military spending,
Hmm.
even cultural exports. So it's almost like they're playing in different leagues. But they both excel at something: tourism. I've been lucky enough to visit both countries. They're both just undeniably gorgeous. In Australia, you've got the Great Barrier Reef, Uluru. In New Zealand, you've got Milford Sound, those incredible southern Alps. It's a tough choice. It really is. They both have incredible natural beauty, but they market themselves differently. Australia really goes for those iconic images, the things that are instantly recognizable, the Sydney Opera House, the beaches. It's very, come on vacation here. New Zealand often focuses on a quieter, more immersive experience. It's about connecting with nature, exploring the hidden gems. It's a slower pace.
So it's like a grand spectacle versus a more intimate encounter with nature. But how do those different approaches actually translate into visitor numbers? Is one winning that battle for attention?
Well, if we look at the numbers from before the pandemic, Australia was consistently getting way more tourists. Those iconic landmarks, the fact that it's so easy to get around, and the scale of their tourism industries, it's a huge draw for travelers. New Zealand, while it has a devoted fan base, it's definitely catering to a smaller market.
It's like Australia's the blockbuster movie drawing in the crowds. New Zealand's more like that indie film that people who are looking for something different will really appreciate. But there's one area where New Zealand is absolutely dominant: rugby. The All Blacks are a global phenomenon. They're incredibly dedicated to that sport.
Oh yeah, New Zealand's rugby dominance is undeniable. They've really turned it into an art form. And the All Blacks, they inspire this level of national pride that's just incredible. It's a huge source of unity. And their success internationally is a point of pride for the whole nation.
It's like rugby is their superpower. That's where they've chosen to really focus their energy. But the research you shared suggests that Australia actually does really well in a wider range of sports: cricket, swimming, Aussie rules football, right?
You got it. Australia has a broader sporting culture. They've got all these popular sports, and their athletes are recognized all over the world. That gives them a lot more visibility on the global sports stage. Think about it. How many casual sports fans can name a famous New Zealander, cricketer, or swimmer compared to an Australian one? Probably not many.
That's a great point. It shows how strategic focus can lead to a ton of success in one area, but it can also limit visibility in other areas.
Exactly. It's a totally different approach. Australia's got this really diversified strategy, doing well in a lot of different fields. New Zealand's more specialized. They're putting their heart and soul into a few key things.
Okay, but before we move on, we have to talk about this. It comes up in almost every conversation about Australia and New Zealand: the accent.
Uh-huh.
A lot of people think Aussies and Kiwis sound exactly the same, which can lead to some pretty awkward situations.
No, it's true. To someone who's not really familiar with the accents, they can sound so similar. I've heard tons of stories about New Zealanders getting mistaken for Australians, especially when they're traveling. It might seem like a small thing, but it really does add to that sense of New Zealand getting overshadowed.
You know what? I think we need to set the record straight. Kiwis say fish and chips, not fish and chips. It's a subtle difference, but it's important.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's those little things that really show how unique and rich each culture is. It reminds us that even cultures that seem similar on the surface can have totally different identities and experiences. They deserve to be recognized and celebrated.
It's interesting because we keep talking about New Zealand being overshadowed, but being overshadowed doesn't mean they're inferior. In fact, there's something really admirable about that underdog spirit, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah.
They're not afraid to do things their own way. They consistently achieve more than people expect. They're punching above their weight in so many areas.
Absolutely. There's a real quiet strength to New Zealand.
Yeah.
It's this resilience that comes from forging your own path and sticking to your values, never giving up on what you believe in.
And let's not forget, they make some of the best wine in the entire world. And they're doing some seriously cool stuff in the tech world, too. They're quietly making their mark in a lot of fields.
They really are. They're such a nation of innovators and creators, always pushing boundaries, defying expectations, and they do it all with this humility and grace. It's inspiring.
So we've talked about size, media, culture, economics, even sports and accents. What have we really learned about this Kiwi-Aussie dynamic? What's at the heart of this rivalry?
Well, I think what's really interesting is that it's not a simple rivalry. It's not about one country being better than the other. It's more about recognizing that each country has its own strengths and challenges. It's about how they choose to engage with the rest of the world, and maybe what we can learn from their different approaches.
It reminds us that success can look a lot of different ways, and sometimes the quietest voices are saying the most important things.
Exactly. And maybe it's in that quiet strength, that commitment to their own values, that we find what really makes New Zealand special.
This has been a fascinating deep dive so far.
For sure. It really reminds us there's always more than meets the eye. Sometimes the most rewarding journeys take you beyond the obvious, past the familiar and the expected.
We'll pick this back up after a quick alone. It's interesting how we keep talking about New Zealand being overshadowed. What if instead of seeing that as a bad thing, we thought about it as something unique, something that actually makes them stronger? Like maybe operating out of the spotlight gives them a different kind of freedom, a chance to focus more on what they're doing instead of how it looks to everyone else.
That is a really interesting way to look at it. It might give them more space to experiment and innovate and do things their own way without feeling like the whole world is watching them. It's like they're playing a longer game, building something that will last, even if it takes a little longer for everyone else to notice.
Yeah. And in a world where everyone wants things to happen instantly and fame is fleeting, that long game approach is kind of refreshing, isn't it? It makes me think about all those articles you sent about how innovative New Zealand is, especially with technology and sustainability. They're really exceeding expectations.
Totally. Think about what they've done with wind farms. They've been pioneers in developing them on a large scale. And their tech sector is attracting some serious talent and investment from all over the world. And we can't forget what they're doing with sustainable agriculture and conservation. They're not just talking about these things, they're actually doing something about them.
And I think what's really cool is how their approach to these challenges is often so different from Australia's. It's not about making big announcements. It's about quietly getting things done, coming up with solutions that actually work.
There's a real practicality to the Kiwi spirit, don't you think? They're not afraid to roll up their sleeves and get to work without meeting a lot of praise for it. It's just part of who they are.
And that reminds me of something else you mentioned earlier, their amazing sense of community. That feeling of everyone working together and supporting each other. You don't always see that in bigger countries where people are more focused on themselves. It seems like a core part of what it means to be from New Zealand.
Oh, absolutely. It's deeply embedded in their culture, their history, their geography. Being a small island nation, often isolated from the rest of the world, it's created this sense of needing each other, knowing that they're stronger when they work together.
And you see that so clearly in how they respond to tough situations like the Christchurch earthquake or the global pandemic. They come together, support each other, and they end up even stronger because of it.
It really shows how resilient they are and how strong their community spirit is. They understand that true strength comes from unity and compassion, from everyone working towards the same goal. It's a reminder that there are a lot of different ways to overcome challenges.
It's funny, we're talking about New Zealand being overshadowed, but there's something kind of exciting about that underdog spirit. We naturally root for the team that nobody expects to win, or the person who beats the odds, the country that quietly makes a difference without needing all the attention.
It's a story we all connect with, probably because it speaks to something deep inside us. That desire to prove ourselves, to make a mark on the world, to leave things a little bit better than we found them. And New Zealand, in their own way, is doing exactly that.
They're showing us that it's not all about size. Quiet strength can be just as powerful as loud confidence. And sometimes the most important contributions come from the people who are happy to work behind the scenes, following their own vision.
It's an important lesson for everyone, whether you're someone trying to make a difference in your own community or a whole country trying to figure out its place in the world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the differences between New Zealand and Australia, what are the big takeaways? What have we learned about how these two countries approach being a nation and how they deal with the rest of the world?
We've talked about how things like geography, economics, the media, even personality can affect how these two countries are seen by others. We've looked at the strengths of Australia's bold, attention-grabbing approach, and we've explored the quiet resilience of New Zealand's spirit, their humility, their focus on community, and their love for innovation.
And I think the most important thing is we've challenged ourselves to look deeper, to appreciate the little things that make each culture unique, and to understand that success can come in many different forms. It's not about saying one country is better than the other. It's about celebrating the diversity of perspectives and approaches that make our world so rich.
It's about understanding that there's no one way to be strong.
Uh,
And sometimes the most powerful impacts are made by those who aren't looking for the spotlight, but who are quietly dedicated to making a difference.
And as we go forward, whether we're learning about different cultures or dealing with challenges in our own lives, it's so important to remember these lessons. Don't judge by appearances. Look for the deeper story. Listen to those quieter voices. Explore those unexpected perspectives that can help us understand more and challenge what we think we know.
It's in those quiet corners, those places we don't always expect, that we often find the most important truths, the most creative solutions, and the most inspiring examples of what humans can overcome.
And maybe, just maybe, we'll realize that being overshadowed isn't a weakness after all. Maybe it's a superpower in disguise.
It could be. Maybe it allows for a special kind of freedom, the freedom to try new things, to experiment, to create something truly meaningful without the constant pressure of being watched by the whole world.
Like you're playing the long game, focusing on building something real and lasting, even if it takes a little longer to get recognized.
And in a world that seems so obsessed with instant gratification and fleeting fame, that's a really remarkable approach.
So the next time you hear someone mention New Zealand, I want you to think about everything we've talked about today.
Don't just see the shadow. Look for what's underneath.
Because behind that quiet exterior is a country full of innovation, creativity, and a spirit that's truly one of a kind.
And who knows, maybe that quiet strength is exactly what our world needs right now.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation.
I agree. It's a good reminder that there's always more to discover, and sometimes the most exciting things are hidden in the most unexpected places.
And on that note, we'll leave you with a final question to think about.
What if, instead of wondering why New Zealand is overshadowed, we started asking what we can learn from them?
What if their quiet strength is the key to a different kind of success? One that's based on being genuine, being resilient, and having strong connections with each other.
Definitely something to think about. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.
It really changes how you see things, right? What if being overshadowed isn't a bad thing? What if it's actually a good thing for them?
I know. Like, it gives them a chance to just focus on what's important in the long run, to build a solid future without feeling like they have to prove something to the whole world all the time.
It's like they're quietly working on something amazing, paying attention to every detail, and then they let the results speak for themselves.
Exactly. And that kind of focus can lead to some pretty incredible things. We were talking about their wine earlier, but it goes so much deeper than that. Their whole approach to sustainability, it's like it's part of their DNA. It's there in how they do tourism, how they farm, everything.
And that connection to the land and to each other, it seems like that's a big part of what makes them so successful. It's not just about growing the economy, it's about making sure people are happy and the planet is healthy too.
That's such a good point. The research you sent was really clear about that. New Zealand always scores really high when it comes to things like happiness, social progress, how they treat the environment. They've created this society where those things are really important, and it shows in their quality of life.
It's like they've figured out the secret, how to have a strong economy while still caring about people and the planet. I think we can learn a lot from that.
Definitely. They're a perfect example of what sustainable development can look like. They're proof that you can be successful without sacrificing the things that really matter: community, connection, and a healthy planet.
So what's the big takeaway for our listeners? What should they remember from this whole conversation about New Zealand and Australia?
I think the most important thing is to remember that the quiet ones, the people working hard behind the scenes, they can be incredibly powerful. The ones who are driven by a real sense of purpose and who stick to their values, they might not always get all the attention, but they're often the ones who are actually making things better.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that being a good leader isn't always about being the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it's about setting a good example, working hard, and staying focused on what's really important.
And maybe, just maybe, our world could use a little bit more of that New Zealand way of doing things, more teamwork, more respect for the environment, more focus on creating a future that works for everyone.
This has been such an inspiring conversation. I feel like we've learned so much.
Me too. It just shows that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the places you least expect.
So as we wrap things up, here's one last thing for everyone to think about.
Okay.
What if the key to a happier, more sustainable future is actually hidden in plain sight? What if it's all about embracing those values that have made New Zealand so successful?
What if their quiet strength is the answer to creating a world where we don't have to choose between having a strong economy
Hmm?
and taking care of people and the planet? What if they can all work together?
That's a great question. Until next time, everyone, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.